One of the most common Protestant arguments is that when Jesus changes Simon's name to Peter, which means rock, and says in Matthew 16:18, "You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church," he uses two different Greek words, Petros for Peter and Petra for rock. Because Petros is masculine and Petra is feminine, they argue Jesus wasn't calling Peter the rock, but rather referring to something else, like Peter's confession of faith. But there is two issues with this logic. The truth is, Petra is indeed the standard Greek word for rock, but it's feminine. And in Greek, you can't use a feminine noun as a man's name. That's why the writer used Petros, a masculine form, to name Simon. It wasn't a theological statement, it was a grammatical necessity. And if that's not enough to convince some, what many still overlook is this. Jesus wasn't speaking Greek. He was speaking to his disciples in Aramaic, his native language. And in Aramaic, he would have said, "You are Kepha, and on this Kepha I will build my church." One word, no gender difference, no grammatical ambiguity. Just a clear, deliberate statement. If Jesus had wanted to distinguish Peter from some other metaphorical rock, he could have easily done so with a different phrase or metaphor. He didn't. He repeated the same word intentionally. If the gospel writer had intended a separation, he could have translated it differently, something like, "You are Peter, but on your faith I will build my church," or "On this confession I will build." But he didn't. He preserved the repetition and only adjusted the Greek grammar out of linguistic necessity, not to change the meaning. In Isaiah 51:1-2, Abraham is literally referred to as the rock from which Israel was hewn. Look to Abraham your father, look to the rock from which you were cut. So when Jesus gives Simon the name rock, it's no accident. Just as Abraham was the foundational rock of God's covenant people in the Old Testament, Peter becomes the foundational rock of the new covenant people, the church. That's why Jesus immediately gives Peter the keys to the kingdom, not as poetic flair, but as a symbolic transfer of authority, echoing Isaiah 22, where the steward of David's house is given the key to rule in the king's name. And the early church understood this without confusion. Tertullian, circa 200 AD. The Lord said to Peter, "On this rock I will build my church," meaning upon him. Cyprian of Carthage. Peter, on whom the church was built, speaks in the person of the church. Origen. Peter, on whom is built the church of Christ. Jerome. Christ is the rock, yet he gave his own name to Peter, that Peter might be the rock because he shared in Christ. These weren't modern Catholics defending tradition. They were early church fathers, writing just decades or centuries after the apostles themselves.